Hello everyone, today we introduce the Spanish Tercio for the very first time on Schwerpunkt. I know it's late, it's been several years now that we skipped this topic. For no real reason, I would have discussed it at some point in the specials, but this is an episode stemming from the cycle, which gifted us with this really cornerstone of early modern warfare, to say the least, especially when we look at Europe, and from Spain actually to beyond the same old continent, indeed, to the world. I recently made different chapters of the Conquistadores era, and so we will delve a bit more into early modern warfare, as you've seen from my Renaissance military series that in the last year or so has been enriched with new specials mostly. Naturally, this is such a huge topic because it encompasses like so many different aspects of Spanish and European warfare. We will mostly stick to the Spanish Tercios, but at some point we will look at things in much greater detail and think about the Tercios of Lombardy, of Naples, of Sicily, just to tell that of the most important, besides the Spanish ones, the many Walloons, Italians, Germans that participated together with the Spanish to the broader Habsburgic alliance, to the Catholic effort at large. We talked about the Landsknechten already. We'll have to address better like the Italian armies of the Italian wars. We began to look at the French as well. And so when you talk about the Tercios, you look at like an entire age, like if you want like the pike and shot one properly meant, and you could start, as we'll partially do today, from, for example, the medieval Spanish military background that is very crucial also from a mental, an ideological, spiritual point of view to understand the aggressiveness, the combativeness, the performance of the Tercios. Why is that this was really the most powerful army in Europe at the time for essentially 150 years? We could talk, in fact, about all the various developments of the Tercio during these centuries because of some very serious issue that I think you're aware of having happened in historiography, that is to say the Black Legion going as far as basically, putting aside like the interest towards the same Spanish armies during the period, which is utterly insane. So basically picturing this idea that the Dutch, the Swedes, were so much ahead at some point with Maurice of Nassau, Gustavus Adolphus in probably the tactical pioneering of pike and shot warfare, leading eventually to surpass, especially with this idea that we have in mind also at that point actually being a French product, that is to say the Tercios defeat at Rocroi. The Tercios continued to go on, and that's true, like that battle was really like a very important watershed in a broader sense, like of the Spanish, from Spanish primacy to in fact the rise mostly of French military power in a greater sense, not just a military one, but properly France becoming the hegemonic continental force in Europe. Realizing that the Spanish had actually been developing their military with the same sort of tactical innovation, sometimes actually more complex and successful way than these other Protestant armies that we have already looked at very often in some depth already, and we have definitely appreciated them, but we also recognize how a certain aura, a certain image that we have of these is more like the product of the times Protestant propaganda, as some sort of magnification essentially of this tactical performance, organization, uniformity, and intensive discipline that actually were to some extent not ideal, but just reflecting the general development also of the other European armies at the time that were not sung in the same ways, and especially later through mostly the British historiography and so from there to the world, mostly like as an anecdote, almost a cliche, right? And this is actually a topic I already addressed in other videos. Like, the Spanish armies haven't been adequately studied or paraded as the Protestant ones, especially in fact the second half of the 16th, the first half of the 17th century. Finally, there is also a later development of the tercio, not really the abrupt end of the system. Also, like all the broader political, strategical context. Think about like the road of Flanders, the connection of the various Habsburgic territories. We made some videos explaining also how, for example, the Austrians relied on Spanish power in their very, say, challenging balance of Central European power. There is, again, this other, for example, the Italian component that is massive and somehow overlooked, because also we decided for some reason that the Italians are not good at war to begin with, while actually it's not just that they produce some of the finest commanders of the era, but in the Habsburgic armies, not just even in the Spanish one, but in fact many tercios being recruited from the peninsula. For example, the Sardinians having a primary role. Also, the Battle of Lepanto, as a matter of fact, is one of the greatest victories of Christianity in history, and one of the greatest battles of the period. So there is a vast scenario that unfortunately I haven't covered, mostly because we haven't talked about sort of general basic early modern history. We just began to venture into sort of the military side of the story. And I still haven't extended that manualistic approach from the Middle Ages or Rome, at most, to other periods, like, for example, ancient Greece or the Hellenistic period, in this case, Renaissance warfare, right? So today we'll just introduce the topic, and then at some point we will overly expand on it, because it's so important, and this was really a video I needed to do. Now, as we will see now, there is also an approximation regarding when the tercio was born, what even tercio means, for example, which is debated. However, we'll see it now, and we can say, roughly speaking, that it originated in the early 30s of the 16th century, or at least that's the traditional, the anecdotal version side of the story. And these military units represented the tercios, plural, a pivotal development in infantry organization, combined arms, pike and shot, and Renaissance warfare as well, right? The tercio marked the establishment of the first large-scale permanent formation created by, in this case, the Spanish, and indeed by any European army, complete with administrative and tactical structures, as well as designated territories. So the initial names included, we said them before, like Lombardy, Naples, and Sicily, that were all territories that the Spanish, as you know, had acquired, either like in the later Middle Ages or during the Italian wars. And as these units progressed, like, they cultivated lasting traditions, a robust sense of fellowship, and earning nicknames such as the Invincibles, the Immortals, because in the broader landscape of Renaissance warfare, like, this level of power display had really been, up to that point, unknown. The Spanish have an enormous power. It's not just due to the Americas, the precious metal mines in the New World. It's really about Spain as a system, right, as a country that has, as you know, at least dynastically unified, and providing therefore a major landmass, very well connected with other lands, especially in southern Italy, and so providing like with an enormous manpower potential from a populace we will see now that was historically, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, devoted to a lot of, probably direct involvement, especially of the local gentry, to military expeditions, ideally against the Moors, but also fighting a lot among the same Iberians. You have Naples, this one of the largest cities in the world at the time. You have like very advanced there, also Italian Renaissance connections, the Italian maritime republics helping. You have the German and the Italian bankers, the Thuggers, the Bank of St. George. So you have like a massive compaction of power that at this point, as you know, during the Italian wars is mostly in alliance with the empire, given that the Habsburgs have, the dynastic sum of these territories, and even when they split in different branches, they remain more or less aligned, especially in the Catholic faith, because not to miss anything. Of course, there is a major spread of heresy, massive trauma caused in the cosmic at a cosmic level by the Reformation to begin with, and also a greatly expanding French power that has also in fact recompacted its national territorial unity that is aimed first towards Italy, then towards the Netherlands, and all the legacy of the Habsburgs of Burgundy in these lands. And so everything is really intertwined to a degree that you can look at also for in my other videos, and that I think is very well known and setting a bit the context, the conditions, which of course makes the Spanish extremely powerful. But it's not like they were just saying. People have the idea that great empires somehow prevailed, especially if they don't like them for some reason, just throwing bodies. Right, that's not how wars are won. Right, the reason why the Spanish were so powerful because they had a hell of an army in strictly qualitative terms, and we will, in part, explain this to a hopefully satisfactory level today. And so, when you look at the tercios, it's not even that this is not even the entirety of the Spanish army per se. Right, the same concept, for example, of the coronelas. Was containing this idea, like the idea of these masses of thousands, especially initially of pikemen, supported by shooters at this point, like acting as essentially the forerunners of all future regiments. This is essentially what the tercio becomes, right, and found really as a general standard in the art of war. So in January 1492, as you know, Granada, the last Islamic avant-post in the Iberian Peninsula, at least of significant power, fell to Ferdinand and Isabella, right? The Los Reyes Católicos. This does not really end the Reconquista, because the Reconquista, properly meant, had finished in 1212, right? After Las Navas, all these Muslim relics in Spain were fundamentally subjected as vassals to the Christian overlords, right? Aside from edicts such the ones of the Limpieza de Sangre and various expulsions of Muslims and Jews, the Mudéjars that were also very important, like in the former armies of Spain, we discussed them for medieval warfare, still remained as also like hotbeds of revolt well into the 17th century, with Ottoman fleets terrorizing the Spanish coastlands and sort of making leverage on these followers, let's say, against constituted powers. So it was very complicated to rule a Renaissance state to begin with, because it was very far from, it was essentially a medieval state, right? Again, I will not repeat myself over and over in every single video, but it was hardly anything absolute, even like in the 18th century about Ancien Regime. You can imagine the 16th. Military expenses, especially being always at the center of the needs of even the greatest powers, especially the greatest powers of the era. I have a little series going on the Armada, which also could not be missed. We will come back on it sometime soon. Now, by the time of the conquest of Granada, Spanish armies relied in a particular way on their infantry, right? It's not like they were prevalently, infantry armies yet in terms of the overall arm decisiveness. the rest of Europe, aside from the Swiss that were making school at that point, was still relying on cavalry, right? Largely as at least the upper arm, like the full dominion of cavalry had ended like from some time, right, or at least it had been unhinged since the beginning of the 14th century with ups and downs. Cavalry had remained, however, the decisive arm. The same case was for Spain, except in different ways. The need for militarization due to this last effort of the so-called Reconquista in this case, as well as some particular social segmentation. The impoverishment, for example, the local gentry was attributed some degree of nobility, and so a tradition of arms, like a historical sort of yes, greater presence of light cavalry in Spain, but a difficulty like in fielding particularly large forces of cavalry adequately equipped. Right, we've seen this in the Spanish and Portuguese armies organization between the 14th and the 15th century. Essentially, the Spanish had reformed their armies during the 100 Years' War on the basis of the French and the English model that they had employed themselves at some point, because apparently, like even large war horses, mounts were not as available for different reasons in the very complicatedly built political and institutional, say, order of Spain. And this is something which may sound bizarre, but we actually illustrated well in the aforementioned video. Well, at this point, of course, the Spanish had their own very good heavy cavalry, there is no doubt, but there was something more peculiar about the entirety of Iberian warfare that would allow at least a large amount of Spanish forces to be fielded increasingly like effectively on foot, right? Swiss mercenaries arrived in Castile even at some point, especially through the Habsburgic connections, introducing the effective pike formations and supporting crossbowmen and handgunners that required strict discipline to cooperate with the heavy infantry. And so, as you know, until Cerignola, this would not really be fully developed in an effective pike and shot route. What really founds, as we will see now, early modern warfare is this combination pioneered by, in fact, the greatest commander in modern history, Gonzalo Fernandez de Cordoba, El Gran Capitan, right? Exactly for this reason. Just in a cultural perspective, how few sort of relevance like the name has, like in pop culture. How often do you even hear the name of Gonzalo de Cordoba, considering his magnitude? Like there are tons of videos say about Gustavus Adolphus, especially like but you know, what about this giant, this overarching figure founding the same art of war of the year? Because the Swiss had just essentially pikemen, and so they could operate in foreign armies, like in this case, together with other tactical components. But here, Spain takes the leap forward and creates an effectively national force that pioneers combine arms tactics due to also the incredible motivation and spirit of corps that the Tercios themselves propagate just as an idea of Spanish hegemony. Now, with the Reconquista over, Ferdinand and Isabella aimed to create a standing army and commenced organizing military through legal ordinances, establishing the Capitania as a fundamental infantry unit. This effort was rendered necessary by the increasing need to counter the very well-organized French army that with its ordinances had established, in fact, like the largest military power of the year, and was looming, in fact, over Italy, and especially the former Angevin possessions that were now controlled by the crown of Aragon. And it is part of a broader process. We've seen it towards like the semi-permanent and fully permanent companies of the early modern era, that some of these countries needed probably a specific moment of their history to compact through a more concentrated power. So something that many major states would sort of not be able to, for different reasons, either because they were too small or because they were too backwards, and or because they started depending themselves on these larger forces as allies, but in a sense also as subjects. The 1497 campaign in Roussillon in southwestern France marked the rise of the tercios with structured infantry categories such as pikemen and sword and bucklered men. As we will see, this is also one hypothesis regarding the actual meaning, like from a third, essentially. One third like, of these various specialties put together to form these thirds, essentially, the tercios. Now, cuirass regulations for pikemen were also established, mostly for the frontal ranks, right? Because normally, like that would have gradually declined. In fact, over time, there was no need just to have all units. This is not even just a Renaissance thing; like it had been throughout basically all military history. But it was important as a form of gradual standardization, right? Of enhanced control, like of enhanced reliance of these units at the disposal of the monarchy that could really count on ever more homogeneous forces. The Spanish sword and buckler men disrupted the Swiss formations in the Italian campaigns of 1494-98, at least at times, proving how crucial this apparently archaic tactical element, so neither the pike or the shot, but some more assault troops could really be. Like the Spanish Rodeleros, in that sense, were actually pretty good forces. They actually existed in under different names also in other European countries, right? And they would gradually be abandoned as a general concept. But there were many contexts in which, especially in this period, late 15th, the early 16th century, it would be really, really good. Think about siege warfare, for example, and or like even in open field, like as sort of incursors, like into the enemy, behind the enemy lines, especially when you were able to outflank the pike formations, or whether these were broken, and you could enter them and engage into hand-to-hand combat in a disrupted formation, right? There was a lot of tactical experimentation at this point, and the Spanish were coming with this important amount of tactical experience, combativeness, especially through the concept that we in fact live on in the Tercio. I mean, a bit like the Habsburgicals and imperial military traditions in Italy, in Central Europe, etc. Of the fact that the noblemen, so the hidalgos, as the Spanish gentry, really was educated, would have to start at least its military service as an average rank and file pikeman, right? Even if they were of noble birth, right? Because initially the majority of the Spanish gentry was really fighting on foot, and they didn't consider it dishonorable because to them it was just like the spirit that mattered, not much their scarce affluence, right? And so this is also like why many conquistadores from Spain left for the Americas. Why they were general socioeconomical situations triggering the large amount of the Spanish manpower into essentially, as we'll see, this was the real deal of the Tercio, voluntary armies, like voluntary military service, because the Tercio apparently did not even need discipline, disciplinary regulations, stuff like that, because imposed, because the mere idea of deserting the Tercio would immediately disqualify you in the eyes of the general, say, cause, right, in at home or abroad, right? There is some romanticism to it, but indeed there is this enormous Spanish potential unlocked by the final, again, dynastic union of the two major Iberian crowns, bringing to lots of these men, like, needing to find their way, right, in the world and fighting for it. Military reforms were further tested in North Africa and Italy. I also made some videos about Tunis, Algiers, and we'll talk more about the further theaters of the Italian wars, which marked in the Spanish military the transition from, you can argue, sort of medieval to modern military organization, influenced by these Renaissance advancements. Spain could afford to deploy this large bodies of troops, also to adequately drill and arm them, and to maintain them properly on campaign for a prolonged time. And this would acquire also a priceless military experience, especially in such an innovative, dynamic, and intense military context like the one of the Italian wars. Gonzalo Fernandez de Cordoba, the great captain, emerges from and molds this very context. He reformed military practices, exhibiting strategic ingenuity at the Battle of Seminara despite facing superior French forces. Cordoba emphasized disciplined retreats, mixed troop utilization, ambush tactics, in part because after this clash, as you know, the French were victorious and the Spanish expeditionary force had remained fundamentally in the outskirts of the Neapolitan kingdom, having to resort to this quasi-guerrilla, right, given that not enough forces were coming to reinforce the Spanish. And it's through this cavalry that Cordoba manages to create like quite adequate and motivated force, right? Having especially like this specific task of beating the French, so creating the effective tactics and even mobility against a heavier cavalry that the French still highly cultivated. In a sense, that's why they lost the Italian wars. Like, France had a much bigger demographic pool and agricultural resources than Spain, right? But they refused to veer away from an aristocratic army, and even though they had pretty good cavalry forces, and they used like the same Swiss mercenaries, they had a very strong artillery park. The decisive element, that is pike and shot combined arms, declines in its development in favor of the Spanish. And instead, again, we've seen from this background, disposed more of foot, and with a particular, again, cultural and spiritual attitude, right, of Reconquista, of, pretty rough. Think about, I don't know, people coming from the countryside and the mesetas, right, with this militaristic, nobiliar mindset, allowing, in fact, for the Spanish to affirm themselves successfully against their main rival in Italy. Right. This included integrating artillery into the broader system, also from a strategical point of view, to capture strongholds swiftly. The French had actually showed how important that was. Cordoba reorganized commands into coronelias for efficiency. So this is really like the same idea of having multiple companies under a same commander, right? So this would be the proto-regimental form, essentially what would develop in the more or less 10, 12 companies during the early modern age. They were set by the Tercios example. The colonel was at the head of these companies, bringing thus to the agglutination of different arms, right? Because companies up to this point, remember, were pretty heterogeneous. Like we've seen also the age of the condottieri, some companies specializing, I don't know, just more, say, than normally they were tactically, let's say, complete, but some were more about heavy cavalry, so some more about infantry or, about missile and so on. So with the regimental form, you basically have, and this was true also within the companies, at every tactical level, like if you had, say, the cavalrymen, you just array them all together on the battlefield regardless of their origin, right? Even with coalition forces, you just have this single battle. The same goes for the pikemen, the same goes for the missile. And so the Cordoba manages to bring this together at a regimental level and starting to toy with this now fully sort of complete, right, tactical elements and alternating their proportions and or at least making the most of their combination in open field. Though practical numbers pose challenges due to recruitment issues, especially after Seminara, this structure laid a foundation for future military organization. And Cordoba's tactics would culminate in the Battle of Cerignola of April the 23rd, 1503. That really marks the beginning of pike and shot warfare, properly meant, where the Grand Captain maximized terrain advantage despite initial artillery setbacks, achieving victory through effective arquebusier volleys and coordinated infantry and cavalry force, especially the pike and shot synergy, right? Building ditches, stationing the pikemen behind them, supporting them with arquebus fire. Like, this is when the French were actually stopped. It was also about maneuvering. It was also about being able to counterattack, which was very difficult at this point, because pikemen, this had been essentially the great deal of the Swiss, that they had managed to confer so much collective training to formations that they had been obliged, like, to cope with stronger enemies, like to provide entirely, or at least by the majority, with pikes, which required, in order to work to begin with, those numbers and collective training, right? And managing finally to advance and steamroll whoever you had in front of you, it was difficult, it was gradual, right? It was not so straightforward, and the Swiss themselves, especially without support arms, would, in fact, end up pretty badly during the same Italian wars, and especially because the Spanish really managed to go past that mono-arm system. So Cordoba is a very interesting figure that was at some point recalled from Italy because the Spanish monarchs feared even Sankup, given the enormous power and fame and glory that he had attained. So we will talk about him in another video, but indeed his military innovations continued to influence later warfare, particularly the Habsburgic-Valois wars, in fact, of Italy, especially the critical years of 1521-26. At the Battle of Bicocca on April the 27th, 1522, Spanish imperial and papal forces led by Prospero Colonna effectively defended against a French assault by the Swiss, resulting in significant Swiss casualties. The later Battle of Pavia on February 24th, 1525, so imperial forces execute a flanking maneuver that led to great French losses in the park of the Villa of Mirabello, including 8,000 troops, and the capture of the same King of France, Francis I, highlighting at that point the superiority of the Spanish firepower, like the combination there was also with the Landsknecht, and so here you have already like a increasingly shared Habsburgic, right, Spanish and imperial amalgamation. Now the Spanish army, however, maintained the upper hand, set the standards also for the empire that very often did not have the same wealth or power of Spain, even just in the same German theater alone. So this tells you again how, not just how powerful the Spanish were, but what kind of strategic projection and general political reliability they could attain through their military. Indeed, the Spanish army was evolving into a professional military model, and that's, as you know, the radical difference with the others, right? Admittedly, it's not before the Sun King that you have properly a modern national army, whereby basically the entire force is permanent and professional and coming from the actual country, in spite of the subcontracting of the various units, management, etc. But the tercios here are really the spearhead, right? These are not like typically in other countries case, like foreign mercenaries or mercenaries of some sort that you hire for a given time, and then you have to disband after compensation, or even without compensating, which was a bit of an issue. This is a specifically national elite core of the army, right? That maintains, in fact, this higher standard and upper hand in the strategic landscape of Europe. The tercios were thus crucial for the Spanish crown's military operations. It would remain that central and famed exactly as the backbone of the greatest European military power. Commanders of the time advocated for keeping the tercios intact for major battles, with their proportions within larger forces varying over time. This naturally depended on the financial strains of the Spanish Empire, which affected recruitment, leading to challenges in maintaining discipline and increased mutiny risks. Think about events like the sack of Antwerp, right, and different issues occurring pretty much in all the other European armies of that scale. This is important to stress. The Spanish made war on a big scale. Like half of Europe could not even properly afford the concept of that, right? Only France, Spain, to a degree the empire, have the capacity to field such large forces under a single command, right? Even coalition forces, but with this bulk of force directly depending on the crown, right? Other states basically can put something together mostly for defending themselves, but it's just like in the case of the Armada, had the English navy been defeated, like there was properly no way on land to counter the Spanish army. So the Bourbon dynasty would replace the tercio structure only in the early 18th century, ending a Spanish military tradition that started in the 16th. The 1536 ordinance issued by Charles V of Habsburg recognized existing units rather than founding the tercios, as it's sometimes believed. Again, the etymology is debated. Some think that it stems from, again, the thirds based on the type of armament, like either pike, shot, or essentially the melee, the rodilleros, or referring to the like at this point the tripartition of the tercios of Lombardy, Naples, or Sicily. Regardless, this is the moment from which we start hearing of these units that are already established by this point due to military needs and were later termed the old tercios, given that they would in fact remain also in their cadres, as a single formations. Now, the ordinance of Charles V, 1536, specifically mandated composition regulations for troops, promoting Spanish infantry while limiting foreign soldiers. This is important again to boost the spirit of corps, having like a greater reliance on troops that were here stationed in Italy, right? So they didn't really have to mix with any other element around to remain more faithful to the Spanish interest, and so the imperial action of Charles V. This created competition, naturally, among different nationalities, leading to conflict, but also fostering a strong military ethos of the same tercios, including the ones that, as we will see now, were not just Spanish. This is very important. In fact, we tend to downplay a bit the role of this other nations, as the Spanish ones were actually the minority overall, right? The tercio organization redefined the military of the time, transitioning from the coronelia to a format consisting of 12 companies that, as you know, will remain basically there for a very long time, predominantly of pikemen with arquebusiers. These formations were formed by consolidating the existing coronelias into groups of 3, which is yet another explanation for the name tercio. The most likely of all is actually that these formations were called after the old 3 battles that had sort of historically existed. It's a bit like the norm in medieval armies, as we've seen multiple occasions. You had, say, I don't know, 3 battle lines, or either in depth or on a single bigger line, which was a very good compromise between, say, flexibility and control, unity of control. This is likely why the tercio was called like this. In any case, the tercio now created counted, as we've seen, 12 companies that would remain there as the basic regimental form, each consisting initially at this point, because the organics would vary over time, as we will see now, of 258 men, ideally, including 2 companies composed entirely of arquebusiers, because they were still split, right? Or at least they tended to group them in different ways. The remaining companies included both arquebusiers and pikemen, in fact, right? So the sense was that you needed some units aside. We have this idea, we'll see it better later, of how the tercio went to battle as a massive square with just these sleeves at the corners. But it wasn't only that, especially in later times. But also, this was a unit that had to perform different tactical tasks. Like, the individual companies could be used on campaign in different ways, even as single units, right? So needing, for example, 1 company of arquebusiers only, right, could be an actual thing already at this time. Which is interesting because, as you know, this wouldn't be particularly frequent in other contexts up to the second half of the 17th century, when essentially pikes had become so weak compared to the shot that would gradually disappear, and the shot began to autonomize itself. We've seen this for the English Civil War, right? That in all those hedges, like, brought to like an ever greater fluidification, say, of tactics, needing mostly shot by entrenching here and there, with much tougher time and lack of space for the pikes. But already at the beginning of the 16th century, there were units entirely composed of shot, right, in different European contexts, including, of course, the tercio, where you could see the best of tactical experiments at work, right? So in the first half of the 16th century, the old tercios setup created a balanced ratio of approximately 1-to-1 between pikes and arquebusiers, which was fairly innovative for this era, given that it was a lot of shot, right, compared to the pike, and it sort of showed, per se, actually the great tactical flexibility and of course a discipline and collective training that even the shot had. Like, it was very ahead, becoming the model for the other European armies that up to that point had just seen. Now they had met, of course, the Spanish, but had mostly based themselves on the Swiss model. It was, again, a mono-arm system to which they could add just like a certain element of shot, right? That started happening quite quickly because these countries, in fact, were generally speaking more, resourceful than Switzerland at that point. That would obstinate itself to keep just that model, eventually being surpassed, in fact, due to such conservatism. But think about this 1-to-1 pike and shot ratio in its innovative character for the time. All the times you hear, but the Protestants later introduced more firepower, and they were experimenting with this idea of increasing that. This is what essentially the system had already been doing from a while. The Spanish were keeping to do that even in those later times, in parallel, and sometimes even on a larger scale of the actual Protestant armies, that in fact were more contained. Right, there is no doubt, especially about the success and the quality of the Swedish model. But even in that case, it's not like these systems were radically different from one another. I made an entire video about the Spanish and the Swedish model during the 30 Years' War, and you realize that actually what the Swedish were doing, increasing sort of the cooperation of various arms, derived also from the fact that they were often inferior in number. They were attacking bigger formations that, in that sense, were not actually wars, right? But they were not under, in fact, the same pressure to need, in a broader tactical and strategical sense, that kind of interaction, right? And European armies would fundamentally develop in parallel to one another without too much like, I was the first one who invented this or whatever. And again, especially a thorough study of Spanish military manuals has already shed enough light on the sort of broader misunderstanding, again, of sort of just very partisan, mono, vocal explanation of this story from the Protestant side. It's likely that a few halberdiers and sword and buckler men were counted among the old tercios pikemen, though they collectively constituted no more than perhaps 5 to 10% of the pike contingent as well. This is important because the pike, of course, must prevail in order to be effective against especially cavalry, and there must be large formations in order to make it work. But indeed, the posterior ranks, the inner ones, do not really need the same level of training and equipment like the others. Like, they have mostly to follow the file openers. There are also the guys that, in fact, must use the pike in the front ranks that have to be better armed. This is even basically all the other armies, including the Swiss, that had never fully reached 100% of pikemen, even just within the phalanx, right? So halberdiers were still there. And again, especially if you look at all those battles against the Ottomans, especially in siege warfare, of course you need some melee troops, right? Especially probably in the narrow confines of, say, fortifications of even urban warfare. It's a bit of a different story. In fact, a bit of an overlooked one, together with, in fact, the adaptability of these troops altogether to the various theaters of war. Even as we were saying before, for the arquebusiers on a smaller unit scale, and for different tactical needs. In the 16th century, an average tercio company likely had around 150 men. In practice, the actual strength likely dwindled. I made an entire video about this. early modern armies were so chronically understrength that this brought to the establishment literally of new units, right, coming from the sum, for example, of multiple regiments, at a point thinking about the brigades, etc., because literally, like the amount of men available was just a fraction of the total. Sometimes, in fact, this bigger formation would actually be smaller than what, in theory, like it's the sum of the ones it was containing was on paper meant to be. Throughout this era, the organization and strength of the tercios often loosely matched the official figures as a consequence, with 16th century tercios typically averaging closer to 1,500 men rather than the frequently cited 3,000. So it's basically, again, 10 veritable companies. Like 150 men is basically like the just the natural biological amount of men a single commander can truly know, remembering every phase and sort of more or less the individual skills of the troops, so that he can lead them as sort of the more important tactical component on the field. The number of tercios grew during this time. So we mentioned before the various nationalities that created that had their own tercio created for the Walloons, for example, the Burgundians. These were organized into tercios near the end of the 16th century. Subsequent formations included Portugal, Liège, Brabant, Flanders, Malaga, Sardinia, and the Armada, the latter being Marines, essentially. But again, there were other German, Italian troops, especially. Many units, especially the non-Spanish ones, were organized as banderas, which did not conform exactly to the tercio format. These were typically organized in colonelles or regiments of various sizes, but they were technically not tercios. Notably, one German unit formed in 1536, the same year we're looking at before, in which Charles V wanted the tercios just to be very Spanish at that point, was exceptionally large, with at least 8,800 troops. So we're talking 20 companies, basically, which was insane. And that probably, like, they went nowhere just as a tactical unit, like they had eventually to be deployed in different sub-units. In fact, such instances were anomalies that you should also explain in the political and strategic context that we don't have all the time in the world to do. Most units consisted of 5 to 10 banderas, featuring a comparable mix of arms found in a tercio as well, so they would doctrinally operate more or less in the same way, but by that time, because again, like most of Western Europe was basically now just following the tercio model, as long as you had in fact such large field armies. This foundational organization appears to have remained intact throughout the 16th century, with only two but still very significant adjustments. The first was a reduction in the number of pikemen, which was naturally occurring because of the increasing performance of firearms. Right, pikemen fell to 2/5 of the entire organic by the 80s of the 16th century. The second change was, conversely, the introduction of the musket, which is sometimes perhaps overstated, considering that the musket sort of evolved over time. As you know, it was even born from sort of small mobile artillery, for how sort of performing it was, and just, you know, what is a musket from like a document of the 16th century exactly? It's not really clear. We're in pre-Linnean times. There was really not the kind of contemporary standardization in arms production. In any case, even the musket is an innovation at times credited to the Spanish army. This is purely speculative because they were being made pretty much everywhere, but the notion that the tercios may have actually been the first ones to exploit this technological, innovation and add to the significantly to their firepower is pretty is pretty plausible, right? Not much because they invented again the thing, but like Italy and Germany were actually the most technologically advanced countries at the time, and again, in this case, the Spanish could have drawn from those mostly Allied lands as well. But the sense that Spain was essentially the only country to equip at least a part of their force now with large amounts of these more expensive, as however more performing weapons is the key to it. In fact, the musket is believed to have been first used in the Tercios during the 60s of the 16th century in this fashion. Initially, musketeers made up less than 10% of a Tercios ranks, but by the final years of the century, Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma's forces in the Netherlands, reportedly had more musketeers than arquebusiers. For what that means, because again, some arquebuses were even more performing than some muskets, but tendentially, that the muskets will end up prevailing. Now, by the 60s, and this is not in fact a coincidence, we know in any case that firearms had increased in importance, right? This had definitely enhanced the Tercios' effectiveness in campaigns, particularly noted again in the Netherlands campaign led by the Duke of Alba, right? It's we are some of the most brutal peaks of violence, also of the era. This all speaks of the most updated, armed forces of the time. In the 17th century, the proportion of pikemen, of course, continued to decline, dropping to as low as 30 and occasionally 20%. Even conversely, the trend towards musket use, which starkly contrasted with developments in other armies, seemed somewhat reversed, as musketeers' numbers sometimes dipped to 10%, did not surpass 1/3 of the total force. This shift might have been attributed to the greater maneuverability of the lighter weapon, of course. Nevertheless, the ratios of pikes to gunpowder units consistently fluctuated along with the sizes of the companies, so that sometimes the entire math is too much of a puzzle to even try to resolve. Some organic changes, reforms, are however traceable. Under Philip III, Tercio companies increased to 15 to 20. Also because, again, they were normally understrength. During the 17th century, company sizes decreased with, in fact, 100, 150 men per company, at least even on sometimes even on paper, right? And so there you have a greater integration of arquebusiers and musketeers along traditional pikemen as well. Well, the number of companies rose initially, as we've seen, varying between 15 and 20 in 1603, and officially set at 15 standardized mixed ones by a regulation in 1632, which also abolished, in fact, companies solely comprising arquebusiers. This is particularly relevant because you understand that these companies become not just part now of a ever more permanent regimental force, but they are very homogeneous and modulated for some broader combined armed tactics that are intensifying, especially with this increasing need of mobility due to the decrease in the pike and in the increase in the shot, right? Which, as we explained before, was obviously due to the fact that the pike formation just had to slowly advance. Basically, pikes remain. I will soon make a video about the genesis of linear tactics to explain the next step, right? But the sense was that as long as the pike units could arrive intact, or at least still combat effective, to attack the enemy, to come to grips with the enemy line, the shot was the lighter arm, the inferior one, and so the pike is needed because at that point you can't quite stop it at close range, and either you dislodge or you have hopefully other pikemen to counter it, right? Whereas in all this, the shot is must be more mobile, right? And this also, like with the gradual decrease of the pike, increasingly exposes it to cavalry that in fact is coming back already from the end of the 16th century, well before the 30 Years' War, after sort of the peak of contraction during the mid-16th century. Think how prominent Spanish military culture was at the time. We made a video about for example, the Landsknecht's fashion was very much inspired, in fact, to the Spanish one. The same term caracol, now that we're speaking about cavalry and the Reiter, this idea of hit and run tactics and in succession yet waves, is also like a term derived from Spanish that means snail, because of the circumvolution, right, of design on the animal's shell. Given the increasing strengthening of Renaissance states and territorial control needs, a militia network was established by Philip II. This militia would prove vital during Philip IV's reign, forming provincial tercios for campaigns with about 1,200 men each. So these were levies. Technically, they weren't, like again, spearheading professionals, but, to some degree you can amalgamate them. Philip V's 1701 reforms aimed for 65 tercios across Europe, but resulted in under 30,000 troops and significant armament shortages. Naturally, we are in a different era. If anything, we will start talking a bit more in depth about 18th century national armies, proper to understand there even what was happening in Spain. Now, the term tercio shifted to regiment in 1704. Regiment, reflecting such organizational change and, in a sense, the end of the same glory of the tercio. Right? I talked about Condé, Rocroi, especially in the video about the 30 Years' War commanders, right? So essentially what happened there, but we will have to talk a bit more about 30 Years' War battles, because that's also a hell of a way for the tercio to ideally go. Now, the tercio had a hierarchical organization led by Maestre del Campo, that is field marshal responsible for administration and command. You have the Sergento Mayor, that is the sergeant major, assisting him, overseeing troop movements and formations. Captains, appointed based on service, led companies, as it had historically been since the Middle Ages, and selected subordinates. The ensigns, the alfares, assisted captains and bore the company standard, symbolizing honor. There was all naturally a great tradition, especially in an age in which it was such a rarity or even an exception to have permanent forces across the generations. The tercios collected an incredible amount of experience and reputation and name and history that was sort of venerated by the soldiers that were honored to serve in its ranks. Sergeants maintained discipline and coordinated training, while corporals focused on squad training and welfare as well. Initially, the tercios were comprised of professional soldiers, but as we've seen, prolonged conflicts, also emigration, and the general needs again to have an ever larger territorial armies, right, to control ever more people, right, ever more effectively, and also resisting to the ever more compact neighbors. We are in the mid-17th century. There is, as a great issue with France until the War of Spanish Succession, when Saint Bourbon, as we've seen, came to rule over Spain and also taking the reins of what was left of the Tercio and changing it. In conscripts, of course, performed variably, and soldiers could naturally progress through ranks, generally taking around 5 years to reach corporal and additional years for higher ranks based on demonstrated capabilities. This is how like the armies in general at the time were working. Naturally, it was difficult to simply rise to the top, especially if you were not a nobleman, right? But here we're rather talking about another phase of the history. In any case, the soldiers identified themselves in this age of Reformation, of Counter-Reformation, as defenders of the Catholic faith and the crown, influenced by the legacy of the Reconquista that had really put at the center the Christianity of the fort, and had emphasized honor and wealth through warfare and valor in battle. The hierarchy of the Tercio included specialized roles at its headquarters. The tambor mayor oversaw training for company drummers, ensuring mastery of drum beats for marching. This is crucial, especially for the Pike band that, as you know, need this Dionysian hypnosis at the rolling of the drum under a hell of fire from their tonic down toward literally foot task of reaching the enemy under such tempest of lead. The Farrier Mayor managed supplies and equipment distribution, with each company having its own quartermaster. The Barragel maintained order as the military provost, while the auditor served as the legal officer, validating soldiers' wills. Medical needs were addressed by the Tercios doctor and surgeon, supported by a company barber. Spiritual welfare was crucial, especially in the age of the so-called wars of religion, and was handled by the chaplain mayor and company chaplains. Each company comprised 4 officers and non-commissioned officers, thus altogether including as a standard bearer alongside a chaplain, a drummer, and a fifer. Tercios recruitment commenced with a royal decree, and aspiring officers needed endorsements to seek promotion from the Supreme Council of War. New officers received letters, patent, and conducta detailing their assignments. Their duties included selecting junior officers and designing military standards, while recruiting in designated towns. This was also the normal recruitment fashion of the era. Officers promoted military life to attract recruits, with a lax enforcement of the age limit for enlistment, leading to younger individuals joining. Existing soldiers had incentives for bringing weapons, while others had to buy their arms with future wages. I made a video about the Spanish rogue that shows you a bit like the general misery of the time. Really the speculation, the difficulties from the side of the same colonels, like to speculate on their commissions, etc. There is all a literature, as you know, the Renaissance, that almost preaches against war in a sort of populistic, moralistic sense. But it's something also we'll see for other occasions. A selection process involved inspections and financial transactions, which sometimes led to exploitation, to say the least. Once recruited soldiers received documentation and traveled to ports bound for Spanish territories. Training, because they could really be recruited actually from other places, telling the truth, not just in the foreign territories. At this point, like, European armies were somehow pretty multinational still, and important was to create manpower. There could be even, at some point we've seen it with among the Landsknecht, and it was full of Protestants as well, even under the Habsburgic Catholics. At the sack of Rome, the Lutherans were not as ferocious as the Catholic Spaniards, by the way, in the sack of the same, mosque, the holiest Catholic city in the universe. Now, Training was, of course, crucial, conducted, as we've seen, by officers and veterans that had seen it all before. But new units sometimes faced disdain from experienced tercios, and this is obvious because the best type of military capacity is gained through active military experience. Integration of new recruits occurred through the so-called reforma, redistributing soldiers for cohesion. Unassigned officers were labeled for this reason also as reformados and could undertake special tasks. Soldiers concluded service with a license and faced challenges regarding desertion because, again, aside from the ideals, there was a regime of surveillance, of retribution, martial law, of course. Training encompassed physical activities like races and swimming to enhance fitness and weapon handling. Soldiers needed familiarity with all standard weapons due to warfare's unpredictability. Initial training focused on individual weapon instruction, starting with pikes. The next stage involved group instruction in fighting formations called squadrons, which depended on manpower, and this, as we've seen, combined arms tactics. Close formation tactics required each soldier to understand his role, as emphasized by Bernardino de Escalante's principles regarding following the flag and obeying officers. Regular formation drills during marches were essential for quick deployment. Most of the effectiveness of these formations resided in the capacity to quickly and orderly, especially, deploy, so to save time and maintain, in fact, good order, cohesion, so to be more effective in combat, of course, with an enemy that may have not been so well drilled, and so losing something. In force deployment, commanders organized simulated wars to practice battle tactics, and some of these were pretty violent as well. So it's interesting because, if anything, the troops had to be habituated to risk, to just loud noises, confusion, smoke, and this could prepare them adequately to at least some aspects of the horrors that at least were in fact much more intense in the actual battlefield. The military's functioning relied on contracts with merchants for supplies like food, weapons, and ammunition, heavily reliant on uncertain funding from the Spanish government. Every army in this sense was pretty much the same, just the Spanish government, after all, was fuller of resources, at least probably in the heyday of the Tercio, and that was, of course, not a coincidence. Vivanderos provided food either through quartermasters or directly to soldiers. Arms and ammo were procured through army authorities with deductions from soldiers' wages for costs and allowances for personal purchases. Contracts specified delivery details and were subject to inspection. Logistics relied on the famed Spanish road, the Road of Flanders, established in 1567, which necessitated, of course, continuous diplomatic effort to keep the route open across Western Europe, pivotal for connecting Spain with Italy and with Flanders, until it was disrupted in 1622. It was much safer to ship Spanish troops to places like Naples, Genoa, and then going north across the Alps and then the Rhine Valley to reach Flanders than trying any kind of circumnavigation of France, right, crossing the Channel. This, of course, depended on many circumstances. That's actually what the Armada itself did. But in general, the Mediterranean routes were safer and more economical and convenient in that regard. by the late 16th century, the Spanish army became thus Europe's foremost military power, also because of its projection capacity, its infantry gaining prominence from the traditions of the Reconquista, and winning this broader reputation for the best soldiery in the old continent, being deployed, in fact, far and wide now across the globe. The superiority of infantry over heavy cavalry had been demonstrated by the Spanish in the Italian wars once for all, because the Swiss could still risk sending this phalanx ahead, and then, good luck. The Spanish showed you could pin cavalry down, then finishing the enemy with firepower. Victories across Europe and conquests in the Americas, of course, enhanced Spanish soldiers' belief in their valor. We've seen it recently with Cortés, Pizarro. There was, in the temper of the time, I made an entire video on this topic concerning especially like the interest in classical military treatises and the possibility to apply those Greco-Roman strategic principles to, if anything, the organization and the fighting of an army of the time, in which the Spanish mostly saw themselves as the Roman legions, right? They were fully embracing this sense of Romanity for many reasons. Because, first of all, because they were the empire now, and they also were, of course, dependent on Rome as the Catholic power. And vice versa, the Dutch at times were sort of trying to imitate like the Macedonians, the Romans themselves, but they were also studying, for example, the Second Punic War, considered themselves as the Carthaginians because they, in that aforementioned Protestant propaganda, they were allegedly like trying to sort out tactical systems to defeat the much bigger, in fact, Spanish forces that they equated themselves in that sense to the Roman legions, a bit as, Hannibal at Cannae, for example. That's, a very interesting perspective, if you want, within the Renaissance. Naturally, the early modern art of war was very different from the classical one. It was that much that could be derived. If anything, the main object of imitation was the standardization of the troops, like the collective discipline, the idea that you could finally, once again, having this large bodies of troops fully controlled by a state as salaried professional soldiers, going with that. Military discipline was emphasized, of course, in military writings all across Europe. Officers, including the Emperor Charles V, held soldiers in high esteem, fostering a sense of personal and collective honor that motivated heroic conduct, albeit sometimes leading to tensions among diverse nationalities within the same army. Because at the end of the day, again, yes, this was the most advanced system of the time. It was reflecting the same times, and so that, as we said before, until the mid-17th century, there properly wouldn't be a national army in a sort of overarching sense, right? And still, it's a world of contradictions to an extent. Saint Charles V, for example, was not much of a soldier himself. He was a Burgundian gentleman, as he would put it. And the brutality of warfare, if anything, was the real school, the real test, the real consistency of the Tercios' capacity, expertise, and reputation. Honor featured prominently in commanders' rhetoric. Right, this was also inspired to the great, lengthy, epic battle speeches you could find in the classical sources. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 saw Don John of Austria viewing the battle as a fight for either victory or death, echoed by soldiers' willingness to die heroically instead of retreating. Such valor was celebrated in military poetry and songs. The mutiny of Aalst in 1576 exemplified soldier morale, with 1,500 unpaid soldiers overcoming a larger enemy force, achieving decisive victory with minimal losses. Speaking of Clausewitzian moral forces, Spanish soldiers' loyalty was rooted in faith, national pride, and allegiance to the monarchy, which granted them exemption from the loyalty oath required of other subjects. This unique status emphasized their commitment to Christianity, the nation, and the monarchy, reinforcing their elite soldier status. Spanish soldiers' loyalty to the king persisted through mutinies, right? I made a video recently explaining this new type of loyalty, like the sense that as professionals they needed to be paid, and so you couldn't simply abandon them in that way. But there was now a higher sense. It's not even just a Spanish national one. The Tercios, as we've seen, are also multinational. There is a deep Catholic faith, a sense of the imperial universal tradition that these men are defending. So any discontent would often essentially arise just from unpaid wages. And the Spanish soldiers notably never mutinied before battles because they did not want to be considered cowards, right? And so there was, again, a deep ethos that we somehow sort of try to attribute also to other forces sometimes considered as mercenaries, like the Landsknechten, that technically were, say, a national force of sort for at least the Holy Roman Emperor. The Swiss, even as mercenaries, had their own loyalties to their own cantonal system and beyond. But of course, that's reflecting the complex system of warfare that really lays at the root of, say, the limits of Renaissance states, right? So there was often just so much that could be done from a monetary point of view. All rulers were basically as critically short of money at different times. When wages were delayed, logistical challenges arose, prompting structured mutinies where officers were expelled, even standards removed, and a council negotiated with commanders to make things right. Failure to meet demands risked execution by fellow soldiers themselves, because, again, they might strictly believed in the matter of life and death that this temporary paralysis really could entail. Mutineers sought refuge in towns, and stricter discipline was enforced with severe punishments for breaches. Hunger and hardship diminished, of course, the effectiveness of the tercios as any other army of the time, sometimes leading to pillaging, which strained relations with civilians that at times were rebellious. Think about the Netherlands in the Protestant case, exterminating them did not even appear as such an enormous deal. Notable incidents of indiscipline, like the sack of Antwerp, and we already mentioned, highlighted, in fact, this declining discipline, though the Tercios generally maintained strict military order as a standard, were, in fact, the most disciplined forces in Europe at that scale of employment. Collective disobedience could lead to disbandment as well, and this was the case, for example, for the Tercio of Sardinia. The Pike, as we've seen, but passing a bit of more of a tactical side of the story, was the dominant weapon of the era. Pike and shot that gets really the first place because, as we explained, it was the decisive weapon when used as an arm in a broader formation, evolving in length and weight to reach up to 18 feet, which at times was also part of the reason of its later demise. Shorter half-pikes were used in naval combat because there is all a maritime involvement of the Tercios, as we were recalling before, also for Lepanto, the Sardinians, etc. Officers carried ceremonial pole arms, which is a thing that would survive into the 18th century, as you know, while swords served primarily as secondary weapons for close combat. We've seen it for the Rodaleros. However, over time, their relevance, in fact, would decrease. Right? Important was just to maintain this bulky, compact pike square and making it break through with the support of the shot. Right? Speaking of which, firearms, as we know, began with simple handguns. Like at the beginning of the Italian War, saying the Spanish still had those kind of what would have been known as scoppiette in Italian. This would eventually evolve with the arquebus, which was already there, telling the truth, but not homogeneously so. In fact, we are at least in the early 16th century when this becomes the primary weapon of the shot. Arquebusiers were equipped to produce their own ammo, and lengthy loading process necessitated a lot of maintenance. This makes you see the accomplishments of Gonzalo de Cordoba in the Tercio shot even more greatly, because it's somehow intuitive at that point that the shot has a future, but firstly succeeding at the risk of your own life, by the way, in those circumstances, in deploying this shot in an ever more like orderly and sort of coordinated fashion with the pikes, is really that innovative. Nobody has really done it at that scale yet, and so the Spanish, as we were pointing out, are the first army to master this and to set the trend for the pike and shot era. Muskets later emerged, as we've seen, as this heavier, longer-range option, gradually replacing some arquebuses while evolving battlefield tactics, influencing the balance between the two. By the late 17th century, so actually beyond our time, flintlock firearms had begun to replace matchlock, as you know, and although both types were still used in the Tercios, Spanish firearms production was centered in royal factories, notably the one in Plasencia de las Armas, which produced thousands of arquebuses and muskets each year. Having this supply in many ways could drastically increase strategic success, because, again, having such supply system supporting such enormous forces meant to automatically providing them with sometimes a crushing firepower that other nations struggle just even to put together, hoping to in fact exploit just the gaps in the failures in the Spanish logistics, rather than even trying to face this armies in open field. The Dutch at most had to fight sieges because they did not really have an army that could match the Spanish one. And this is true throughout basically the entire 80 Years' War. There are some, of course, Dutch fortunes, successes, etc., but as I explained in other videos, they were almost more accidental and connected to almost like a chance, like how the armies encountered themselves in the field, than a veritable will, like the same Maurice of Nassau often disagreeing with the parliament regarding the conduct of the campaign. Now, the term Biscayan muskets was used to differentiate heavy matchlock firearms from newer flintlocks in that later time. The armor of the Tercio soldiers also changed throughout this time. In the 16th century, this was essentially the peak of the use for the Tercio. Soldiers known as coseletes wore heavy armor weighing around 18 kilos. Officers had more ornate armor, while lower ranked picas secas, this was like a simple pike basic, typically wore metal helmets but lacked body armor, which was practically useless to the extent, again, most of them would not be in the front ranks, and even at that point it was better to deploy in the front line on the flanks, as we will see now, generally the shot, which was more important to invest in as opposed to armor, because like there was a disproportion there in energy provided by firearms that would render, in fact, armor obsolete over time. But especially the rodeleros, these other troops that would engage even with, I don't know, on the ship's decks against the Ottomans, or this kind of scenarios, needed, of course, armor. This was still the age of armor. This was also for the cavalry, that, however, was not that enormously out there at this point, yet still charging, and sometimes literally also into the pikes with cuirassiers and more. Now, as firearms became more effective, thus the use of plate armor decreased, with Cosaletas transitioning to wearing only a breastplate and helmet, which were largely phased out by the century's end for lighter, more mobile attire like the broad-brimmed slouch hat. The Tercio employed tactical formations called escuadrones. I talked about them, specifically in their tactical performance, in a video comparing that with the Dutch army. These units were adaptable based on terrain and enemy presence. Soldiers had specific spacing requirements, with pikemen needing about 1 foot for their placement. Formation arrangements were calculated, of course, using square root methods, with adjustments made according to enemy cavalry. And the requirements for frontline strength was a great deal at this point of also theoretical experimentation in a geometrical, mathematical, too often abstract and ideal sense. Warfare was something else, but the principles behind the formations, as we'll see now, were important. Like, we have this idea, the typical idea of the early Tercio formation, that sometimes on history books you see lasting until, I don't know, the mid-17th century, 30 years war at least. And that, in fact, is a bit just like the stereotypical early 16th century, like the full formation that the Tercio would employ, where pikemen are arranged in a solid central square, naturally a tactic inspired by the Swiss, with 4 mangas, that is, sleeves, of gunmen at each corner, connected by thin screens provided by the arquebus companies on each side of the square. Hence, remember before, the 2 shot-only companies, right, that had that task, like of literally siding in, like, also along the perimeter, like pretty squeezed, along the same depth of the 10 companies that were, in fact, much, say, like more like columns, right, deployed in that way. Also for the functionality of advancing, but forming a square altogether. This is very important because today we will not look in depth at sort of properly the size of the formation, but for one specific reason, that is, while this formation we just explained is sort of the most typical and ideal when you think about the Tercios days of glory, at the end of the day, it wasn't always used, even at the time, in this fashion. Again, first of all, there are so many different theaters where you have to realize how these troops would operate regardless of the bigger engagements. And don't think that the Renaissance is actually that better documented compared to certain parts even of the later Middle Ages, to properly make us picture like the variety of engagement types, especially when historiography has overly paraded treatises that at the end of the day do not show a good much about the reality of warfare. And in fact, it turns out that commanders of the time did not even really read for especially like a strictly military purpose. Like there was, again, mostly this Protestant school that overly emphasized the issue for political reasons, for gaining sympathies from abroad, etc. But aside from the fact that the Spanish indeed wrote similar things for also more strictly technical purposes, what we get from the latter is exactly a much more varied picture, and actually one that shows that many innovations, including again the notion of having thinner formations and more alternated fire, whatever, was actually being pioneered in the Spanish army. It wasn't like a Dutch invention. Especially the Dutch again maintained very low military standards. Like the greatest Dutch army, it was really the top in the world in terms of especially cost-benefits ratio. The Dutch were very good with money at that point. It was an entirely mercenary army. Is at the end of the 17th to beginning of the 18th century. I also made a video about that. The one of Maurice of Nassau was so telling you. The Spanish were stronger, right? And they also had simply bigger, more powerful armies to begin with that the Dutch did not really want to face in open field. They didn't even need to, given that, as we explained in other videos, there was an increasing statistization of warfare due to the spread of fortifications. Like, there was a big deal of aside from the battlefield, in fact, in developing, in that sense, in a much more concretely sort of and traceable manner through the treatises, fortificatory art that still the end of the 17th century was puzzling most commanders. What we see is really that this bulky square formation was used in those times in which mostly that was the way of war for the other enemies as well, and the Spanish had the bigger square. Let's put it in this way. Size does matter sometimes. And it obviously reflected that specific combination there, having mostly pike squares proper, and so not much of a necessity even of rendering them more flexible, because it's that single punching mass that matters. The shot is not as powerful yet, whereas towards the end of the 16th century already you see the need of having a less cumbersome formation, even though like these big blocks were still there in the into the 17th century. And again, it depends on how modulated they were in terms of depth, of length, and so on. So it's not simply a matter of the Spanish always fought like that, and then the Protestant armies came and defeated that. When did that happen actually? Like even during the 30 Years' War, like the imperial armies were technically as a whole, like mirroring a greater power than the Swedish were in that sense more qualitative, and they achieved the most out of, like, in terms of parity force, but it's being smaller, they could do that also sort of less often on a general basis, and still other Protestant armies of the 30 Years' War, it's not even talk about the northern German ones, like they were pretty much steamrolled by the Catholics. So in a sense, like there would be many ways to explain this, but today we do not have time. Let's say that the mangas, those arquebuses, the short sleeves, essentially grew wider and stronger, with gunmen at the rear being removed because they could not simply deliver the firepower, given also that the reloading time was shortening, and so even the need of having, again, deeper formation just for having like this files now shooting one after the other to allow having somebody always firing were not needed, just to maintaining that actual rate of fire. Of course, this was increasing the width of the formation, so again, the reduction of the pike, the coming back of cavalry, what this was about. And of course, the advantage of this formation, given the power that the force is available, was getting a greater firepower, right? Still, however, the pike was there. Again, if we talk until the mid-17th century, an advantage over the linear formation was the capability, for example, for all-round defense against flanking attacks that the pike square maintained, especially over the latter, but also frontally, because at least, yes, we would have also in that case thinner lines of pikemen. And you understand, you take away from one you add to the other and vice versa. It just depends on essentially now the means at your disposal in terms of how much firepower you can inject as an army, aside from, how you can prearrange it, right? It happens all across Europe. The Europeans are fighting basically in the same ways, all right? So on the longer run, the tercios as well pass from this bulkier squares to semi-linear formations, essentially still maintaining 9 to 12 ranks, say by the mid-17th. And pikemen were arrayed centrally with arquebusiers flanking them before this. This was the normal arrangement, enhancing fire support and defense. You get thinner lines and so more stretch, and so you have basically now the arquebus is not sort of hiding on the flanks or even behind the pikes and shooting just in different ways, but just now participating to frontal attacks. And again, there were so many archaic ways of going also in other armies that do not really really prove that the Spanish were doing something, say, less effective than the others. This notion, again, that they wouldn't be able to exploit this new tactics or that they did it the old way, it's not really even supported by evidence, right? The fact of having massive pike squares that can basically just advance into armies that do not have as much in the period in which the pike is still there as as an arm, the decisive one, is actually proof of, it's the definition in that context of strategic superiority, right? They weren't sort of idling targets, just waiting to be finished off by, this combined arms tactics that nobody had seen it coming. They were using the same exact tactics themselves, so we have a sort of strange idea of how people think that the Tercio remained just there, as some sort of archaic thing that could be surpassed by other systems, right? Battles are won or lost for reasons that wouldn't even have to do with that, were even the Spanish so sort of backwards, which was definitely not the case. On the contrary, it does seem that they were even more advanced, and especially because they were so at a bigger unit scale, right? Now, as of course, then this in the earlier period, as firearms advanced, their use relative to pikemen increased. This impact on the formation depth and enabling volley firing techniques is well documented already in the age of Philip II, for example. In battles, shot detachments would withdraw for pikemen to engage, adopting stances suitable for enemy types. During engagements with other pikemen, lower ranks would position their pikes for combat, while arquebusiers would attempt flanking maneuvers. So you see, really much of what technically the same enemies were doing. High risk pursuits like at the Battle of Nordlingen demonstrated the importance of discipline. That was far more relevant, in fact, than even just what kind of this minimal differences that could have existed between an army and another in that sense. If anything, the bigger the army, also the more disciplined this shots must be in order to, say, outflank the enemy, for example. And very often, all these battles were quite rudimentary. I mean, even if you look at the Swedish armies, they were pretty much the same, of the Spanish. And basically, the formations sit there, and it was mostly just leadership, morale, training that really made the difference, rather than any more specifically innovative way of war. This would help. But again, if you have the bigger force, you do not need to innovate as quickly. But the Swedish are also, again, an exception. Again, the other, especially the other Protestant armies, do not seem to have gone anywhere close to that at that point. Tercio squadrons were flexible, often including soldiers from different tercios and utilizing surprise attacks known as the encamisadas, where soldiers wore white shirts for identification during nighttime attacks. So there is, as we were saying before, all these sort of background operations that you do not see as often, but at the end of the day are performed regardless of times, like the good old, surprise and speed and aggression are always used by those who can dare and have the most and have that chance and capacity. And some fail, some not, but if you were to study just all the various battles that were happening at the time and all the various consequences, the various aftermath outcomes, like all what has been written about pike and shot warfare technically would basically be null to a great degree, considering that, in fact, we've been also fed this notion of the infantry, say the revolution or whatever, the military revolution, to more comprehensively. That has not really helped anyone to understand how, like, in the bigger scale, this thing really worked. Because when you study warfare, what matters is not technology. What matters is politics. If you don't understand how or why these soldiers fought and where, in which theaters, during which campaigns, their strategies, their tactics, what's the point just of fixating on the proportion of muskets over pikes, while you don't even have that reliable data on a larger scale, and you just essentially rely on anecdotes said by this or that source, and not even study systematically like the entirety of manuals of other countries, maybe because you don't even know the language. That's literally how history is being done. You would think in 2024 we actually know what was happening at the time, because we study the stuff from centuries, right? No, right? Nobody has done that. Nobody has practically embarked themselves in that great enterprise, if not like at a very small level, and especially without looking at the rest very often of the same Europe, which is sort of insane if you want to make any breakthrough in that actual comparative type of military history. So in many ways it's actually insane. In many ways it's sort of weird how we created this historiography without backbone. And on the other, I'm always very perplexed when I see that whenever I see this, like, first of all, 95% of the people, let's be honest, do not even understand what I'm talking about, but they feel like half of them or more feel the need of thinking that this is, again, the lesser people's chance to shine, and think that it's all a plot, a scam, that, history, now you can invent how history was because this guy said, no, you don't understand that without that academic background, you go nowhere. But not just with this topics, but in life in general. Like, if you can't think at that level, you cannot solve problems. You're not actually useful. In a bigger scale, you can't be labor for cheap labor. You can't have the miserable life that the average person has today. But you're not coming to dictate anything. Actually, whatever you're thinking, that today you think that a populist revolution could be, actually is ever more worthless. What people thought was much more important in relative terms, I don't know, even 20, 30 years ago. People had literally more individual power. Today you don't. You actually have less. So this is also a radical indicator, let's say, of actual, whether you're historically literate or not, that if you cannot distinguish between absolute and relative, you cannot take any sort of historiographical criticism as a sort of, so this is what I think my fantasy about history means, even if I don't even know what this guy has spoken about for 2 hours. Just know that it's a severe problem. It's an existential problem. It's not a matter of personal opinion. Nobody cares about uninformed people's opinion, and never will. And things are not changing in the opposite direction. Actually, they're accelerating along this, and so it's terrifying to really witness happening real time on the internet. I'm not specifically talking just about my channel, because people nowadays seem like whatever video I upload, they just watch the ideological ones. They don't understand that in order to be a fully complete human being, you must study the art of war as much as you have to study politics or society. No, it's just thinking, this guy that made so many history videos, now he's talking about history or religion, so now I feel special because I can imagine that, he's right, even, again, if I don't understand a damn about that. Unfortunately, again, that's always the point. Like, if you don't understand these videos, if you don't listen to this stuff, you cannot understand anything about the rest. And I'm just like, I can make thousands of videos on the internet, but it's not like I'm ever covering like the entire human knowledge. So there is no discount, there is no cheap supermarket option for which you just watch one video and so magically you become literate. No, right? I cannot do that for you. Like, you can only do it for yourself after decades of extremely painful sweat and tears, and not just by wishful thinking, which will simply shipwreck you where at the end of the day you deserve to be, because that's what life is at the end of the day. So I'm glad to have discussed, as you understand, in a bit of a general way, the Spanish Tercio. I think I highlighted sort of the most obvious aspects of the wall, and then we will surely come back on the topic at different times, because it really deserves. And there is not even just this about the Spanish army. First of all, we have to properly talk about the infantry, the cavalry, the artillery. So those are all other chapters that we will be adding. I'm glad, if anything, that we're finally talking more about the Renaissance warfare. I think by this point we really started to make lots of pretty nice videos. I also weirdly noticed, I don't know how this video will go, because people are weird, you never know. Like, some people look at Spanish stuff and they don't watch it because, the Black Legion, or they don't want to feel challenged in their assumptions, or maybe just watch it because they're Spanish, which is arguably even worse, while not watching all the rest, of course. But here I see 108 videos already on Renaissance warfare, which I, place between 1500 to 1650, and it is actually starting to be something. This is largely merits of the cycle, not of the later specials, but I'm glad because we managed to cover so many different topics that you can't find on YouTube. And generally speaking, these are videos that do fairly well, right? Look at this weird stuff, just to make an example. Nobody watches, for example, yesterday I made a video about the 12th century knight panoply and tournaments. Like, it's 2 hours and a quarter about like a PhD in medieval warfare, telling you the entire sort of traditional, spiritual, military, brutal dimension of 12th century warfare. But I'm starting to realize that people are just too ignorant to understand even why that's an important thing. I make videos about ethnic things and the Germans, like everything is the Germans, everything is German, and they watch like here, Landsknecht dress. I'm talking for 40 minutes about how these guys got dressed, and it gets a disproportionate amount of view. I make a video about the Trace Italienne, and nobody watches it. You see, it's that level of complete cultural illiteracy at every level, like, meaning if you have this disproportion, like, this is not because YouTube put the video up or down, whatever. This is literally people that are hyperly selectively obsessing with things without abstracting, without understanding anything, and abstracting from reality at all level, just because they have superheroes in mind, and they actually don't understand or know anything about anything else, including the very topic they're obsessed with. This is, I'm telling you pretty brutally, pretty straightforwardly, my experience on the internet. It's ever darker, it's even more grotesque and insane, right? And through this, I'm actually seeing and understanding how, there's really scarce hope about the world, really, but really scarce. And unfortunately, this is also what the reality of the media is, the reality of social networks is, of such big platforms. It's just ridiculous. It's farsesque, right? Sometimes, for example, I make very specific titles and topics. If you search for them on the YouTube search engine, they will not appear. Like, say, I make a video just for the sake of example like this. Let's assume I made a video that nobody has really made a video on, that is related to the Tercio. I type the same topic. YouTube will start bombarding me in the results with, look, instead of the actual title of the video, they literally shoot you in the face. This, look, Renaissance armies, or the Swiss, the greatest mercenaries ever, or whatever, like this kind of BS that actively prevents the finest content to be obscured. We're talking about, again, the usual 15 minutes long video, half of which is like sponsors, introductions, pictures, and no explanation. It's something ridiculous at the end of the day. And nobody watches my videos that have otherwise a pretty high engagement rate, so much so, actually, that the external views, mostly from Google, are actually starting to surpass YouTube suggestions among the views on my channel, right? Which means that basically YouTube, the people want to see the stuff, they search for it on Google, and YouTube does not show it to them on the same platform. It's utterly ridiculous. It's utterly ridiculous. This is actively working against. It's a deliberate choice. This is not simply the algorithm. This is literally saying this could be like an encyclopedia of some sort. People can go inform themselves. Zero. Just, it's in order to make people, to engineer people in ever more mentally feeble individuals, and that at some point we'll even stop watching YouTube, because if this is the trend, YouTube will be even too much high standard of intelligence, and that is alarming enough. But say we'll get to the point at which TikTok will be too mentally challenging for the average chicken brain, and so that's really a huge issue. But say if you want to do something serious, like share this channel, I say it at every video, don't just click on what YouTube feeds you, or just on the topic that you think you could be remotely interested for emotionalistic reasons. Just be an actually responsible person and do things that actually work, because this is not like a serious way of behaving, like from anyone involved, right? I'm making my part. I know that my content is not overwhelmingly entertaining in a general sense, but it's never really meant to be entertaining in the canonical sense. It's meant to be disclosing, informative, historically critical, and that's what people, like, I think mature people should be into. That's it. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.